Okay, thank you so much. I just get all excited and giddy and then I forget. So, all right, we're going to talk about statewide elections. Like I was saying, we have 9 statewide offices. The founding fathers, and they were fathers of Washington State, didn't trust hardly anyone, and so they attempted to diffuse power by creating 8 separate statewide elected offices and then later added the insurance commissioner. So we have 9 in many states. Some of these positions would be elected and some would be appointed through various methods. Much as with choosing judges, every state has sort of its own system. So that being said, all right, there's a couple of close races in here and some others that likely won't be that close. One of the things that, as we've talked about before, really has an impact on Washington state elections is population density and the prevalence of Democrat voters in some parts of the state and Republican voters in other parts of the state. So here's a map of population density. And if you see the red areas, you can see that that's where the majority of people live. And then, of course, the darker green it is, the fewer people that live in that area. So those red areas tend to be where Democrats are concentrated. So it's very hard of late for Republican statewide candidates to win because they tend to not do so well in central Puget Sound, especially King County. I mean, if we add up Pierce, King, Kitsap, Snohomish, and maybe Whatcom, we've got more than half the population of the state right there. There's another way of looking at it. As you can see, the red is King County, more people, the darker the green. Once again, the fewer people. Garfield County has fewer people in it than Normandy Park. So let's let somebody else in here. So it's very, very difficult for Republican candidates to win statewide. Some do. It's not impossible, but you have to sort of not lose badly in King County to win. So now, insurance commissioner, this is the office that the legislature actually added early in the 20th century. And the incumbent is Mike Kreidler, and he's been there like since before medicine. I think he's running for his 6th term. He's won handily every time. His office regulates all insurance, not just health insurance, in Washington state. And Kreidler takes people on. He takes the insurance industry to task. He takes people who cheat on their insurance to task, insurance salespeople and sales companies. So he's probably not without his critics, but I think he does an okay job. He's pretty accessible. In my tiny world, this is my test. Can I call him? I can call him. He will talk to me. So now the guy who's running against him, Mr. Patel, if you read his voters pamphlet statement, it's interesting to say the least. He did not campaign. He has raised no money, and still in a race with Kreidler and a libertarian and Mr. Patel, he got 27% of the vote, which tells us a couple of things. There are some people, and I'm sure it would be true the other way around, some people who are just determined to vote Republican. His statement, well, he says he's running for office because now he's old enough. He's apparently a part-time insurance salesman. And he said that he will be the external insurance commissioner 60% of the time, and Kreidler and Anthony Welty will divide up the other 40%. Welty was a libertarian who ran for the office. He says he's going to hire 168 people out of the insurance industry, and they will be the internal insurance commissioners. I mean, it's out there. I don't want to make light. He said he's an autistic savant, which might very well be true. But in any case, one doesn't get the opinion that this is someone who's entirely ready to run an operation of this size. So it seems unlikely that Kreidler will lose in this election. Now, I'm going to be surprised if he doesn't retire after this term. in which case in 4 years, we would expect that 2024 we'll see a number of people running and probably some candidates who are in essence sponsored by the insurance industry, since Kreidler has spent so much time ensuring that they abide by the laws of the state of Washington. So not much drama there. Mr. Patel's voters pamphlet statement being probably the most interesting part of the race. Still hasn't raised any money. Okay, Secretary of State. Now, this is a much closer race. Kim Wyman got just over 50% of the vote in the primary. She trailed earlier. She's incumbent. She's, I believe, seeking a third term. She's done a lot of work to make it easier to vote and easier to register to vote. In Washington state, she's a Republican, but she simply works to try to get more people voting. She's come to my class several times. She says all the right things. So she's not sort of an extremely vulnerable candidate. That being said, the Democrats keep trying to take her out. This time, their candidate is Gail Tarleton, former legislator, former Port of Seattle commissioner. So by no means an unqualified candidate. But if you look at the stuff she's saying, it's pretty thin. There's not a lot there in which she's attacking Wyman where you might be saying, yeah, how come she's not doing that? I mean, the chief of her complaint seems to be that Wyman is not sufficiently anti-Trump enough in her statements. While I would have concerns personally, you may feel differently if she was a solid pro-Trump supporter, but one never gets that impression in anything that Kim Wyman says. The other side of this, which I think is unfortunate, the Times endorsed Wyman, and they said, you know, the real tragedy here is that Tarleton's leaving the legislature, at which she was actually pretty effective. She was a good legislator, so she's giving up her seat to run for this office. It'll be very close, presumably in a strongly Democrat year in a strongly Democrat state. Tarleton has a chance of upending Wyman. But Wyman is a solid campaigner. She's been doing this a long time. She presents well. So there's some chance she will hang on to her seat. I will not be surprised to see this race go either way. Like I said, these are two perfectly reasonable candidates. It's just a question of, do people look past sort of the party labels and say, is there some reason to give this job to Gail Tarleton? And I personally am not sure that there is. In fact, I got a survey call. I'm out walking the dogs, happen to have my cell phone with me, and they called and they said, well, you're going to vote for governor? And I said, well, Inslee. And then, you're going to vote for Kim Wyman or Gail Tarleton? I said, well, Wyman. And they just hung up. So that was the end of that. Anyway. State treasurer. So this is a similar kind of race. Dwayne Davidson is the incumbent. He was a Republican. He got into this office in 2016 largely because of the top two primaries. So in that year, there were 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans running in the primary. And the 3 Democrats got the majority of the vote between them, but they split it so that the 2 Republicans went on to the general. And the guy who ran against Davidson, the other Republican, was an investment banker who had some interesting ideas and some other things where I thought, you don't actually know what you're talking about here, do you? Davidson was Benton County treasurer. He was endorsed by 36 out of 38 county treasurers in Washington state. Now, in the primary, Policiotti, a former legislator from Federal Way, he got 53% of the vote. So one would expect that he may do even better in the general election. Now, the Times recently endorsed Davidson. They said, well, it's not good for the state if all of the statewide office holders are Democrats. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's largely a technical job. State treasurer's job is actually very important. They manage the state's funds. So one of the things they do is take care of the float. The float is the state collects all this tax revenue. It doesn't have to go out right away. So they invest it in the short term, which generates revenue, which provides more funds for the state to provide services. So that's very important. And they work with county treasurers, and they're sort of the state's banker and investment banker. So it's an important job, but it's not a political or a partisan job. I mean, I suppose you could try to make it that way, but I wouldn't expect either one of these guys to do that. The other thing about Policiati running is that he gave up his seat in Federal Way in the 30th Legislative District, and he brought interesting things to the legislature. He led a push to reform corporate penalty laws. They hadn't been changed since the 1920s. I mean, the biggest penalty you could levy against a corporation for breaking state law was $10,000. Well, for modern corporations, that's nothing, right? So Policiati worked on that. And so he was bringing some expertise like Tarleton that the legislature could use. Now that's going away, so he can be state-led state treasurer. Could be a close race. My betting is on Policiati. Honestly, don't know which way I'm going to vote here. I like Policiati. When I dealt with Davidson's office for research, they were pretty helpful. That always says something to me. Once again, my tiny world. So could be a close race with an edge to Policiati. It's an office that probably most people don't understand. I didn't understand it until I researched it. So might be a change there. We'll see. Now, Superintendent of Public Instruction. This is a very interesting race. The Office of SPI oversees K-12 education. Big deal, right? Biggest single chunk of the state budget, important to the future of the state, affects hundreds of thousands of school children, et cetera, et cetera. So the incumbent is Chris Reichdahl. This is supposed to be a nonpartisan office, and of course, it really isn't. So they don't run with a party label, but you read two sentences and you'll know which way each of these people stand. Reichdahl's a former state legislator from the Olympia area, was elected the first time 4 years ago, and on the whole has done okay, I guess. I think the most interesting thing about him is that he actually was a teacher. And that's sort of so uncommon from what I observe. What I always say is, well, those who can teach and those who can't, well, they make education policy. That's usually what I observe. He was a school board member, then became a legislator, and now is the superintendent. He only got 40% of the vote in the primary. Now, that was the most of any of the candidates. There were several candidates. Maya Espinoza, the nonpartisan Republican in the race from Eastern Washington, she got 27% of the vote. She talks about technology. I mean, the kinds of things that people have. Well, we need to make better use of technology, et cetera, et cetera. The big issue that she's been pushing is, of course, Referendum 90, the unfortunately named sex education bill. A lot of the bill is not about sex. And she says stuff like, well, it's going to teach sexual positions to fourth graders, which is absolutely false. That's just nana. But she said she has a master's degree, but she doesn't. Apparently, there was a class she didn't finish. It was from Western Governors University. Now, that's something that we invested in some years ago. I don't know whose idea this was. Western Governors University people don't take classes, they just take tests. And as some people have said, that's kind of like the difference between getting your driver's license and actually learning how to drive. So from what I've read about WGU, I'm sort of less than impressed. She also said that she runs a nonprofit, a Latino leadership organization. However, it's apparently not a nonprofit because they didn't fill out all the forms. So there's some little discrepancies there. Could be a very close election. Could be a very close election. It depends how much people are persuaded one way or another, I think, really about Referendum 90 and what that particular piece of legislation will do if the voters fail to overturn it. So that's one where you could see a change. Espinoza doesn't have as much elected experience as Reichdahl does, and that makes a difference when you're trying to work with the legislature. So something else that we might think about. Okay. Attorney General. Well, this is an interesting race, if only because I'm on all these email lists and I get all these fundraising emails from Bob Ferguson. And if you just look at them, you would think that he is running against a billionaire combination of Mother Teresa and Einstein. And in fact, Ferguson's raised like $7 or $8 million, and Larkin's campaign chest is not even close to six figures. So Larkin is a big Trump supporter and doesn't think that Ferguson should be suing the president as often as he has. And Ferguson, notes that he's sued Trump 36 times and won 35 or something very close to that. So Ferguson was a likely candidate for governor had Jay Inslee actually gotten the Democrat nomination for president. So you should expect probably to see him run for governor in 4 years, depending on how things shake out, as we'll see. We'll talk about that in a minute. Not likely to be any change there. I expect Ferguson to win comfortably. He's got something to sell, and I'm really not sure that Larkin does, other than, well, he's a Republican, he supports the president, so that might be to your tastes, but I'm not sure that describes a majority of people in Washington state. So shouldn't be too close of a race. You never know. The partisan nature of these elections, in which people feel really strongly one way or the other, may just mean a higher turnout overall, in which case the outcomes might be closer than we might expect. So, all right, state auditor, very interesting office. So they audit the books of every state agency on a regular basis. And the interesting thing about them, though, is that they don't have any enforcement powers. So while they can find discrepancies in somebody's books, they have to get the state attorney general's office to do something about it. Pat McCarthy is the incumbent, former Pierce County auditor. I don't hear any complaints. She did fairly well in the primary. She has more money. Chris Leba, former law enforcement professional, touts his investigative experience, which is a reasonable assertion to make. That being said, it just doesn't seem likely that he will be able to pull out a victory here this kind of year, when we expect Democrats to do better. So that could be proven wrong. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again soon. Okay, Commissioner of Public Lands. Now, this is a very important office, and I think people will be paying more attention to this going forward. If you remember all that smoke from a couple of years ago, well, the Department of Natural Resources has the state's largest fire department, and apparently it's not big enough because we had so many forest fires, and they say this is likely to be the pattern for some time to come. Climate change means changing rain patterns, means drier forests, and when they catch on fire, they burn more. Some people are arguing, well, you need better forest management practices, and there might be some truth to that, but I'm not sure that fixes the whole problem. Franz was also a likely candidate for governor had Jay Inslee vacated the office, raised way more money than Sue Peterson, and did far better than her in the primary. Peterson's not unqualified. She has forest management experiences. The trick for the Commissioner of Public Lands, and from my observation, this has been true for every one of them, they really have two tasks, one of which is sort of preserve the environment of Washington state, the other of which is to manage state lands for the benefit of the whole state, including economically speaking. So, how much timber are you going to be allowed cut? How much grazing land is allowed? What do we charge companies who want to try to mine for things, and what lands do we open up and what lands do we keep closed? So that's a tricky thing. My sense is that Franz has a better sense of that than perhaps Peterson does. In any case, once again, strongly Democrat year. Franz is unlikely to be unseated, particularly by a candidate who has not really raised enough money to run an aggressive campaign. So unlikely to see a change there. Lieutenant Governor. Now, as we've talked about before, this is the strangest office in Washington state. It has only two official duties. one of which is to fill in for the governor. We'll come back to that in a minute. The governor is incapacitated or leaves office, then the lieutenant governor takes over. While Jay Inslee was running for president, I gather Cyrus Habib, the current lieutenant governor, was actually kind of busy. The other job that they have, and it's also important, it's become more important, is they are the presiding officer of the state Senate. So the presiding officer of the state house is the Speaker of the House, a member of the House. The lieutenant governor is not. So they stand up there with a gavel. A couple terms back, the lieutenant governor, in fact, ruled a motion by Republicans is out of order because it was unconstitutional, and they were kind of stuck with that. So they can vote to break a tie, which ought to strike you as odd because there are 49 people in the state Senate. It is rather unlikely that they will have a tie. And in fact, there are historical examples of senators who were ill being dragged from their sickbed so that they could get to the Senate floor and vote and avoid a tie. So why the founding fathers did that, I don't know. That one's just odd and curious. Our two candidates are both Democrats, Denny Heck and Mark Elias. Now, Mark Elias is a sort of a historical footnote because he's basically the guy who put Dwayne Davidson into office. 4 years ago, he ran one of the three Democrat candidates for state treasurer, helped them split the vote, didn't apparently run a very good campaign, but siphoned off enough votes that the Republicans came out on top. So Elias is the more leftist or progressive of the two candidates, been in the legislature for a while, looking for another job, I guess. I don't know. Denny Heck was a longtime state legislator, then later served as chief clerk of the state house, which is sort of the top civilian official of the house, then ran for Congress, served 5 terms in the 10th, representing the 10th district just south of us, and then got tired of that, came home and is running for lieutenant governor. Now, here's why this might matter. Let's say Joe Biden wins the presidential election and he decides that Jay Inslee should be his Secretary of the Interior because he's a crusader for trying to do something about climate change, and all of a sudden whoever's lieutenant governor is now governor. So it is for once. I mean, this is not a job that has ever led to anything else. I think one Secretary of State later ran for lieutenant governor, but this is sort of not one of those positions that's a stepping stone to an even higher office. There are no lieutenant governors that were ever then subsequently elected as governor. Heck would seem to have the advantage. He's raised about 4 times as much money as Elias, 2 Democrats. So who knows? And I don't really get a sense to what extent either of them is really out there campaigning. I mean, I'm sure they are, but theirs are not. It's not a high profile office, and these are not high profile campaigns. Heck might win just because people can pronounce his name more easily. I mean, that kind of thing happens, right? So, okay, which brings us to the governor's race, which is an interesting race, if only because you have really strong contrasts here between the two candidates. So you have Jay Inslee, who is very concerned with climate change and thinks government should do something about that. He stepped up to the plate with coronavirus and took actions that he felt would keep the people of the state more safe. Not a great governor, not an awful governor. Legislators I know say that he could be more involved in the legislative process and, helping to move things along. But by the same token, most people involved in state government don't wake up in the morning saying, God, we've got to get rid of Jay Inslee. He's way ahead in the polls. What were there? 28, 29 people in the primary, and Inslee was far and away the top vote getter, over 50% of the vote. So his opponent, Lauren Culp, who you may recall is the police chief of Republic, which has even fewer people than Garfield County in it. And he was a People have taken him to task for being a high school dropout. Well, he got a GED. There's no shame in that. I mean, that to me, that's a non-issue. But on the other hand, 10 years ago, he decided he wanted to be a cop, and he ended up in Republic, and they made him a policeman, and then their tax base eroded, and the other guy retired, and he got named police chief of a department of one, and then became famous because after voters approved stricter gun control laws, he said that he would not enforce it because it was unconstitutional. So, police chief to constitutional scholar is apparently just a little quick hop, step, and a jump. He was asked about this recently on the campaign trail, and he says, because the courts have consistently ruled that, in fact, the law is constitutional. And he says, well, they don't teach the Constitution in law schools. At which point, several law professors from the state's law school said, hello, yes, we do. He doesn't think the state should do anything about climate change. He also doesn't think people should have to wear masks. He said, well, people should be educated and then they should decide, which to me entirely misses the point. You wear a mask to protect somebody else, not to protect yourself. And if people can just do it or not, if they want to, people won't be protected. I think we only have to look at the White House recently to see how that could be true. So Culp has a fair amount of money to run a credible campaign. One interesting thing I found about him, he's not anti-union. He is against right to work laws. The thing that I think tends to get overlooked, you may disagree, is his real lack of political experience. I mean, if you want somebody to be an effective governor, they have to work with the legislature. If Mr. Culp would be elected, he doesn't know many of the legislators. He doesn't, he does not have experience with having to get the votes you need in the legislature to get your policies through. Now, he may be smart enough to figure that out. I honestly don't know. The history of candidates like this who managed to get elected is that they don't know how the system works. Arnold Schwarzenegger got elected governor of California. It was apparently a real surprise to him that he had to work with the legislature, that he just couldn't wave a wand and make things happen. Jesse Ventura, who was elected one term as a wrestler, was elected one term as governor of Minnesota. He apparently also had a very difficult time working with the legislature. I mean, that's just the way the system is designed. It might be right, it might be wrong, but in any case, it is. So now Culp says he's for less government. So, if he doesn't care what happens or doesn't think things should happen, then maybe that's not an issue. That being said, although there are Culp signs all around the fringes of the states. I was talking to somebody earlier, drive north. We were on Whidbey Island a couple of weeks ago. Lots of Culp signs, lots of Trump signs, a few Biden signs, almost no signs for Jay Inslee. I don't know if that's just simply not an emphasis of theirs, or if this is just a case of, what we're seeing here are the loudest voices. Clearly, it's an election that's bringing out people who feel strongly one way or another. The president is a polarizing force, and Culp, rightly or wrongly, is sort of part of that. As far as I can tell, he's pretty much a Trump supporter. So you have a clear choice in this election. I mean, you have a guy who says, really, we need less government, and a guy who says, well, really, I think government can help solve some of these problems. So it's not A and A. It definitely is A and B in this election. That being said, given the nature of this year, given the fact that Inslee came off looking pretty good to many people with regard to his response to the coronavirus, he should get reelected. I mean, honestly, I thought, where was this guy when you were running for president? I think he spent too much time on climate change and not enough sort of painting himself as a man of action. So there's that. Now, This is interesting. Referendum 90 is an effort to overturn a bill passed by the legislature last year. It's a comprehensive sex education bill. It was not sort of the best choice of names because a lot of the bill is not about sex education. So the opponents of it say stuff literally like, well, this bill will teach sexual positions to kindergartners. No, that is not true. So K3 portions of this bill talk about general health and safety and common sense and stuff like that. And as it goes on, students get older. Yes, they get exposed to more things. Parents can opt out, and 60% of the school districts in Washington state have already adopted this curriculum. That being said, people have concerns about, what their children are being taught and whether that's appropriate. And it's about a subject about which people disagree. So I'm not trying to make up your mind one way or another. I don't think it's a bad bill. I just think it's badly named. One of the parts of it, they talked about skills-based education. Well, if you're an education professional, that can have a meaning that is something other than, hey, kids, it's time for sex practice, right? But a lot of people from the outside of the education world would look at that and go, what are you talking about there? So they really should have thought about how they describe some of the things in this bill. So, and I don't know which way that's going to go. It will certainly motivate people to come out and vote on either side of that issue. So that could be quite interesting. Now, like I said, 2 state Supreme Court races on the ballot, and position 3 features the incumbent Raquel Montoya Lewis. She's the state's first Native American justice. 9 members of the state Supreme Court. They serve 6-year terms. They are the court of last resort in the state. They, like the U.S. Supreme Court, they meet in a group. They hear arguments. They can decide whether they want to take cases or not, and they have a big impact on things that happen in the state. Most notably recently, the McCleary decision, where they said state constitution means what it said, thou shalt amply fund K-12 education. So Montoya Lewis is opposed, being challenged by Dave Larson, a municipal court judge from Federal Way. He has run before, once again, a nonpartisan office with a clear Democrat and a clear Republican. Larson is a property rights advocate. He didn't do that well last time. I don't actually expect him to do better this time. Friends of mine who are conservatives are very supportive of him. But the thing about electing judges is that they can't really say how they'd rule on a case because they are supposed to decide cases based on the evidence presented before them. And the only people who could tell you whether somebody would actually be a good judge or not are attorneys. And they're not saying anything because no trial attorney wants to end up in front of in a case in front of a judge who actively campaigned to get unelected. So it's a mixed bag, right? Other states, they appoint them. The one virtue to it is that they have terms. So you get elected for 6 years, and if you don't do a good job, people can vote you out. And on occasion that happens. So I would expect Justice Montoya Lewis to get reelected. The other race, also kind of interesting, we have G. Helen Whitener, who I believe was appointed to the seat. So she's running for an unexpired 2-year term. And so she's been in office, lots of endorsements, highly rated. Her opponent is kind of interesting, Richard Cearns, an attorney, but an educator, and really has never served as a judge and really hasn't spent that much time practicing law. Most of his professional life has been in education as a teacher and an administrator. And he talks about that, in his campaign material, and cites that as important experience to have on the bench, which I think is true, but still maybe not enough there to unseat Justice Whitener. Here again, one of the things that happens is that the judicial elections come at the bottom of the ballot, and if you look at the totals, the vote totals fall. So by the time we get to Superior Court judge, way fewer people have voted for that seat than, say, voted for president and governor at the top of the ballot. And I think that's because people are afraid to be wrong. You get down there and you go, who are these people? And, you know, the voters' pamphlet statements all tend to say similar kinds of things. You know, he's tough but fair, he's compassionate, and on and on and on. And where they went to law school and who's endorsed them. Honestly, the endorsements would probably tell you more about which way this judge leans than anything else. So those are our statewide elections this year. There could be a couple changes there. In light of everything else that's going on, we sometimes forget about these things, but these offices will affect us over the next 4 years. Do you have any questions? Yes, Suzanne. You'll have to unmute yourself there.
Thank you. If Biden is elected, and if he chooses Inslee for his cabinet, and if Denny Heck then moves.
You got muted again there. You're still muted, Suzanne. You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go. So if Denny Heck becomes governor,
who fills in as lieutenant governor?
Well, that's an excellent question. The governor could conceivably appoint someone to that position. They would have to run for the remainder of the term at their earliest convenience, which is to say the next election. So if that was to happen, then, you know, in 2021, you might see a race for lieutenant governor on the ballot. I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say, it does Denny Heck or whomever fill out the rest of the term, or do they also have to run for the unexpired portion? The difference being that they wouldn't have been appointed. You know, they just followed the order of succession. So quite likely the lieutenant governor becomes governor as long as they keep getting reelected, but the new lieutenant governor, having been appointed, would then have to probably run for election to the remainder of term at the next opportunity. So good question.
I would also like to ask if you are as overwhelmed with the events of the past week as I feel.
That's a good question. Yes. Well, you know, 2020 just keeps getting crazier by the week, as many people have noted. The meme I saw today that kind of sums it up was, congratulations at having lived 97 years in the last 9 months. So it's certainly a different time than what I'm used to. As I have said before, I've been hearing about the death of the Republic since I was about 10 years old, and knock on my wooden head, it hasn't happened yet. They certainly are interesting times, but if you think about it, this still doesn't really hold a candle to the Civil War now, does it? I mean, you know, we don't have hundreds of thousands of soldiers under arms shooting at each other. Knock on my wooden head. So it certainly is a different and challenging time, at least as far as our lifetimes are concerned. There's no doubt about that. One of the things that people have suggested is that it's probably okay to take a break now and then, and just for a few days stop paying attention and give yourself a breather. You know, because if you're really wrapped up in these issues all of the time, whatever side of the fence you're on, that gets pretty tiring. That certainly gets pretty tiring. So hopefully we get through the election and things change and we get back to something like normalcy. But, you know, we'll see. I want to leave a better world for my grandkids than maybe it is right now. and I'm sure everybody wants that. So other
Thank you.
questions? Yeah, good question, Suzanne. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Joe.
Has Rick Dahl taken a position on 90?
I think Reichdahl supports the legislation. Well, like I said, most school districts are already doing this, so it's just trying to provide some consistency. Parents can opt out. There was one school board candidate in Federal Way who was apparently saying, "Yeah, but my kids will still hear about it anyway," from the kids who were there. In defense of what they're proposing to do with older students is the research-based notion that doing things like teaching abstinence only simply fails to keep kids from having sex any more than they do. So teaching them about informed consent and making it clear, particularly to young women, you can say no, right? And that's okay. So I mean, I think there's some important stuff in there. I just wish they'd sort of done a better job of packaging it, because I can understand how people can get upset just looking at the surface and maybe not fully understanding what they're doing. So, and it'll be interesting to see how that motivates voters to show up. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good. Other questions? You're going easy on me today. Yes. You'll have to unmute. You got to unmute there. I'm still not hearing you. I'm so sorry. You might need to turn up your volume.
Gene, we can't hear you.
I can't get the picture.
Okay, good. I can hear you now.
Oh.
Thank you, Douglas.
On the insurance commissioner, I don't know if I misunderstood you. Did you say Mike Kreidler could lose this election? Or?
No. Mr. Patel is not actively campaigning, has not raised any money, and anybody who reads his voters pamphlet statement should come away thinking this guy's not ready for this office. I don't doubt his sincerity, but the stuff he says makes no sense. I mean, there is no external and internal insurance commissioners, and even if you could sort of pull that off, I can't imagine that would make the office function better. It's remarkable. And the fact that he made it through the primary election is even more remarkable. I mean, Anthony Welty, a libertarian, probably thinks we should have less regulation, but I mean, his statement was more coherent, and I do believe he campaigned. So, yes, John.
Yeah, what is the view of the land commissioner candidates on managing the forest fires in Washington state?
Well, Hillary Franz has, campaigned to get more funding for that, and it's going to take that. I don't think she's immune to the idea of sort of active forest management, clearing out some of the underbrush and selective logging and whatnot, so as to not to prevent such a buildup of fuel that the fires become unmanageable. I would expect that Sue Kiel-Peterson would probably be more aggressive in that regard, but she's a Republican, and they tend to come down on the side of, well, we should be making more money for this from the state, for the state. The fees from state timber sales go to the Common Schools Fund, and they're a chief source of funding for, maintaining the facilities and upgrading schools and whatnot. And, whatever you think of that, those things do have life cycles. So you got to build new schools every so often. So the question is, which one of them would strike the right balance? I don't presume to answer that for you. I get the sense that Franz at least thinks about that, which not every lands commissioner has. Some have erred too far on the side of preservation, and some have erred too far on the side of development. And either one of those things causes problems for the state as a whole, and particularly rural communities where the economies are so closely tied to resource extraction, timber and mining and grazing and that. So
Okay,
it's,
thank you.
yeah, good question. What else can I tell you? I did not watch the gubernatorial debate, so don't ask about that. I have a limited tolerance for pain, and it wasn't going to change my mind either way. And apparently the debates, although they can be very entertaining, don't appear at any level, maybe local ones, but certainly not at the state and national level. They don't really appear to change outcomes very much. People, by this point in the campaign, people are largely decided one way or the other, and the debate will simply serve to confirm what it is that they already believe. I did see a lot of comments on social media about a certain fly on a certain vice president's head.
Yeah.
Yes, Joe.
Is there any reason to pay any attention to these advisory votes?
No, this is a gift of Tim Eyman. And Mr. Eyman got an initiative through that said that any change in state revenues must be subject to an advisory vote. The ballot measures utterly lack context. I mean, you see this and you don't even know what the money's going for. And while they regularly pass, they make no difference. I mean, honestly, it's just a needless expense. It's not sending a measure to the legislature. Nobody wants to pay taxes. We'd all like to keep more of our money, but taxes remain the price of civilization at some level. So legislators, and honestly, this includes many Republicans too, I think they all understand we're going to have to pay some taxes to get the stuff that we say that we want. So yeah, you don't actually have to pay attention to them.
Good, because it's really boring.
Yeah. And there's always a bunch of them, and it's little tiny stuff sometimes. So good question. Anything else there? Yes.
I was just wondering about the King County Superior Court Judge position 30, which is two really good candidates. I wondered if you knew anything about either one. It's Douglas North and Carolyn Ladd.
Oh, wow. Hang on. I will switch over here and take a quick look at them. So I happen to have the state voters pamphlet up over here on a different screen. Judicial. No, that's the primary. Never mind. Let's go here.
Do we have a voter for the national?
I haven't got my voters pamphlet yet, so you're ahead of me here. Scrolling down here, King County, Doug North and Carolyn Ladd. It won't let me load the candidate profile. The things I would look for are, the stuff that they're actually allowed to say, right? Where did they go to school? Okay. What was their prior experience? Who endorsed them? What are their bar association ratings? And do they say anything sort of really stupid in their voters pamphlet statement? You kind of read between the lines there. And if somebody says something and you think a judge can't actually do that, then you know that might not be your ideal candidate. So about those candidates, I don't know enough. And as I may have said, that's why we get such drop off on the bottom of the ballot because that's where the judicial races end up, and fewer people will vote for that race by far than voted for president or governor in Washington state. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't be more help there. Let me see if I can get that to open again. King, where are you? No, won't open for me. I may have timed out on that. If you see who endorsed them and who might have made campaign contributions, that can sometimes tell you kind of which way each judge might be leaning. I mean, they're only human. They are going to have opinions. If they're doing their job, they try to set those aside and rule on the cases as presented before them. But they're only human, so I'm not expecting perfection in that regard. Any other questions? Yes, Suzanne. You have to unmute yourself again.
Okay,
There you go.
is that a position on which we would vote,
King County Superior Court Judge?
position 30?
Yes, you will. Yes, you will. Yeah. And it really is a little bit frustrating because, clearly these are important races. And I think the reason people tend to vote less often for them is that people look at that and say, I don't know who these people are, and they don't want to be wrong. So rather than that, they just don't vote. That being said, there's just always trade-offs, right? I mean, the governor could appoint them all, or there could be a judicial commission. Some states have that. Some states, I think Virginia, the legislature picks the judges. And even in states where they get appointed, they have sort of an up or down vote at the end of their term. So, and every system has its advantages and disadvantages. People have made what would appear to be good decisions in judicial elections. If you think back to last year, the year before, we talked about Nathan Choi, who was running against Stephen Gonzalez for state Supreme Court, and he'd done pretty well in the primary, and people were a little bit concerned. He was clearly not qualified to be a state Supreme Court justice, but Gonzalez won convincingly and won in every county. So people of all political stripes sort of looked at that race and said, no, this guy's not the right guy. On the other hand, there's Charles Johnson, who is up for re-election this year. He is unopposed. He was first elected. He was just a kind of a ordinary attorney from Tacoma, not a particularly high profile. And he filed against a guy named Keith Callow, who was the sitting state Supreme Court Chief Justice and was highly regarded in legal circles. And Johnson won. And this was before there was as much campaigning as there is now. And the only thing people could figure was that people liked his name better. And so he won. He's still on the court. I guess he's okay. But there was nothing terrifically wrong with Justice Callow. He just had the wrong name. As I said, a colleague of mine who runs our paralegal program, a fine attorney, also my best friend, Bruce Lamb. And I've said, you should run for judge. I mean, you have the perfect temperament to be a judge. You're smart, you're fair, you look at everything. And he said, no, nobody wants Judge Lamb. They want Judge Hammer, Judge Jackboot, So I told him, look, change your name to Bruce Lamb of God. You pick up the Christian conservative vote, but he hasn't gone for it yet. So, yes.
This isn't a question, but the reason I brought these two up is because they're both highly qualified, except Judge North has been there since the 2000. And the other candidate, who is also highly qualified, is new. So I was trying to figure out.
Oh, okay. Well, now that's very interesting. I mean, that's one of those times when, if you knew an attorney and you could pick their brain and said, what do you think about Judge North here? 20 years is not that long on the bench. That being said, honestly, I'm going to have to look at that one too. That's really quite fascinating. I would be curious as to why Ladd decided to take on North. I mean, here's an incumbent who's clearly been reelected multiple times. Neither one of them has a bad name, so that's quite fascinating. So there may be something going on behind the scenes there. I mean, they're not all as obvious as, you know, the unfortunate Jeanette Burridge, who finally got unelected after she insisted that women not appear in pants in her court. They all had to wear dresses, and as you can imagine, that didn't go over so well. So
That's stupid.
it's probably not fair, right? Probably not fair. I sometimes marvel at that. In grade school, young ladies still had to wear dresses when I was in elementary school, and it took, you know, an act of the principal to let girls come to school in pants during that enormous snowfall of 1968. Everything froze over, you know, and it's like, oh, for God's sakes, let them wear pants. So different worlds, different times.
Dresses weren't modest on the playground.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That's why when I was a girl, girls didn't do all those sporting activities.
Ah.
You got in a dress.
Yeah. Question, Joe, did you raise a hand there? Yes.
Yeah. Aren't these judgeships jobs decent jobs? Why are there so many unopposed people?
Well, one, not everybody wants to do it. Okay. It doesn't suit everyone's personality. Two, I think one of the things we've seen is that it's not always easy to unseat an incumbent judge. So why would I want to spend my time and money taking on that task unless there was some obvious reason for this judge to get unelected? So we tend to see, I think, more contested races at the highest level because there are sort of more salient issues going on there that tend to get people excited enough to say, we should band together and try to get this person out of office. And I'm not saying that's a right or a wrong thing. That's my impression. I mean, the Court of Appeals is extremely important to the judicial system in Washington state. And those folks are hardly ever opposed because people just don't think about the Court of Appeals. My friend Marlon Applewick, who's been on the appeals court for some time, and he hardly ever has an opponent. I mean, he'll be there till he gets tired of it. Which might be soon, I don't know. But the Supreme Court being high profile, that's the one that seems to attract more candidates. So. And then the lower levels, not so much. Other questions?
What are you going to talk about next week?
Well, next week we're going to talk about the federal races. So we'll talk about the state's 10 congressional races where at least one of the campaigns is sort of up in the air, and some challengers are still, you know, hoping to unseat people in other races. And then, of course, we will talk about your favorite subject, the presidency, and see where we're at that moment in time. So, and no, I don't watch those debates either. I would just go nuts. All right. Well, I am delighted to be with you all again. Be well, stay safe, vote early, vote often, right? And I'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Tia.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you all.